As the United States enters its new presidential phase, it is important to remember and to bear in mind where it stands with regards to its relationship with Africa. And there are three things that we must keep in mind as we do this review. One, advancing trade and commercial ties with key African states. Two, protecting the United States from cross-border health and security threats. And three, supporting key African states' progress towards stability, citizen-responsive governance, and self-reliance. Welcome to this special report on relationship between Africa and the United States. My name is Ponce Ferguson. Today we will address issues relevant to the continent and to America, howbeit trade, economics, security, threat, and more. We hope to provide an expert overview and a dialogue on United States economic and security interest in Africa, more specifically, West Africa. To that end, we've invited someone who is well-versed in American economics and politics. Professor Bismarck Agbengbile, welcome to the show.
Oh, Mr. Ponce, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you.
It is important to note that Professor Agbengbile is a seasoned investment banker, educator, policy analyst, author, and serial entrepreneur who is passionate about transforming lives by solving complex challenges with common sense solutions to help businesses thrive internationally. But Professor, you are more than just a banker and an educator. In fact, for 18 years, you led functional teams invest, deploy, and manage projects in technology, trade, education, and manufacturing areas. And you began your career in finances, in fact, with Bank of America. Tell us about that.
Well, Ponce, again, thank you so much for that introduction. I didn't know you were actually talking about me or somebody else, so those are really kind background. But as you alluded to, I actually started my career at Bank of America. Right after undergrad, and I didn't even know I wanted to get into banking. It just became by accident. So when I finished my first degree, I wanted to go to law school. So I actually packed up everything that I owe. I owned more wine bottles than I had clothes, or I had books and wine bottles. That was my collection. So I got in the car for a 3-hour ride and went to Philadelphia to start a whole new life. And I just stumbled right onto Bank of America, literally. And I walked in and said, I'm looking for a job, and why I wanted to go to law school. And then once I got into the banking sector, God was very, very gracious to me and moved up the ranks, and then became vice president of the retail division for Workplace Banking at 27 years old.
At 27 years old. In fact, in 2010, you were a founding partner of Bernstein & Bernstein Investment Group in West Africa, which we know today as Plug-in Corporation. What is Plug-in, and what role do you have in that corporation?
So as you alluded to, right? So we started off Bernstein & Bernstein. When I was here, a few partners came together. We set up a boutique investment banking firm to deal with areas of fintech, manufacturing, and ensure that we became an advisory firm. And then later on, we changed the name and wrote it into Plug-in Corporation, which shifted a mandate a little bit to focus more on technology. So where we can build products and services to solve common sense solutions within the space of fintech, economic development in those areas, and also in commodities and manufacturing.
Now, which leads to what we are here for today. How would you assess the current thermostat via bilateral relationship between Africa and the United States, specifically West Africa?
To address that question head on, I think the current thermostat between the relationship between the United States of America and looking at the continent, but more specifically West Africa, is that it's transitional, right? It's carpe diem the moment, where there's a great opportunity for both the continent and the United States of America to see how we can reset that relationship, to look at issues around climate change, to look at issues around security and then economic development, in an area of food insecurity. So there's a ripe opportunity for both countries, country A, the United States, the continent, and more specifically in West Africa, to see how we can begin that dialogue again around economic growth that is a win-win for both parties.
And you said earlier transitional. How viable is that transitional movement?
It is in the current landscape that we're in right now. We're looking at the China factor. We can talk more about that later.
Right.
Then also looking at the economic growth that is happening in this part of the world, and looking at the population boom and how we can link that to the U.S. recovering after the pandemic, to see where the economic growth will come into. So I think it's a great conversation to start having around partnerships and around equals, right? And then looking at the 2063 agenda that is being championed by the African Union to figure out exactly how both areas, the United States and then the continent, can form a partnership that can create a win-win situation.
You've heard of the term boots on the ground in terms of the military operation. Now, facts on the ground in terms of the economy and the diplomacy that should exist between these two regions. It is a fact that within the last 4 years, the United States and Africa, the relationship between these two regions has reached its highest low, so to speak, as far as the gold standard. How can the United States restore its image on the continent?
It's been clear. It's clear that the relationship has been stained the last 4 years around the world, where the United States, we have lost our premium of being the beacon of democracy, where many have saw the United States to be a place where civility was the norm. We've lost a little bit of that shine, but I'm so confident that could be restored in the following 3 areas. And I think number one, the United States is at a inflection point right now, where the moral fiber of the entire country, right, is being questioned and being asked, how do we become better? And we're gonna win that. With this current administration in office, Joe Biden made it very clear that he's going after the soul of America. And I think having that, the values that Americans hold so dear to ourselves is the values that many African countries share. So I think if we can come back and have a conversation around what are the values that we hold dear, and then looking at the fact, you alluded earlier, the boots on the ground and looking at the number sets. Number one, by the year 2050, it's projected that the population on the continent will be 2.5 billion people. Majority being the youth. Number two, the relationship of foreign direct investment, China versus the US. In 2017, the Chinese invested $148 billion on the continent. Same, the US, 58 billion. There's a gap there of our level of engagement. Third, it's extremely important that the United States of America sees what is happening on this continent from a national security perspective. How do we engage the young? How do we ensure that economic mobility is a reality? And I think that's a conversation that we can have to kind of rebuild that relationship again in a level of engagement and realize that the African continent is going through what we call a renaissance period. And the United States can play a very vital role in that part.
Okay, and to that extent, what are some of the current interventions that the United States has in place to bolster trade, diplomacy, and other interventions on the continent?
Well, a great question. So we started off with Prosper Africa, which was not to replace aid. It was pretty much to bring the 17 different agencies that the U.S. uses for economic intervention, security intervention, health intervention, to kind of streamline that process. So we have what we call Prosper Africa. Under that, AGOA, right? The Africa Growth Opportunity Act. That's a channel that we have. Then we have Exim Bank is a channel. We have the MCC is another channel. And then Power Africa Initiative under the Obama administration. So we have some tools in place already that we got to make sure that these interagencies are connected together to ensure that we're speaking with one voice when we're on the continent. Let me give you an example. So you have Nigeria, 200 plus million people. Then you have Togo, right? Very small in population. Our interaction with both countries cannot be the same, should not be the same. But how we speak on the continent, the issues around infrastructure, water resources, both hard and soft. Has to be a holistic, standardized approach. So we see Africa as a holistic partner than individualized, because each country has different needs. And we've been having those conversations, and I think the U.S. there's a room for improvement, and I'm very confident that we will win in the future and create that win-win partnership.
Now, speaking of the continent, you know that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is in operation. Can you explain how United States businesses and policy makers can collaborate, or should collaborate with the African Union on that initiative?
Just for the record, it's a game changer for the continent. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is certainly a game changer. It makes Africa the largest trading bloc. European Union had their trading bloc. We have our trading bloc with Canada, Mexico, and so forth.
Right.
And this Continental Free Trade Agreement, for the first time, allows free movement of goods, free movement of people, and it creates this inter-regional trade bloc that can increase in wealth, that can ensure that Africans are producing what they need, and vice versa. Where the US stand, and I think many of the policymakers in my circle are extremely excited, is how do we engineer what we call BOT, build, operate, and transfer. Engage in the knowledge skills transfer, partner up with their counterparts in many African countries. Let's use West Africa as a particular example, to ensure that small businesses are empowered, that they have the education, the necessary grants, where they can see their business more mobile, right, and more global.
Right.
And then using technology as a hub to allow that to happen.
Now, give me a specific example of collaboration between small businesses in the United States and their participation within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Phenomenal. Let me give you an example. So you're a small business owner, you are a maker of shirts, right? You have platforms where you can sell online, you have a brick and mortar store. Now imagine being able to see a market that you have in Cameroon, a market that you have in Togo, a market that you have in Nigeria. Export those goods there, right? In the beginning, the way you develop a relationship, you have to pay your duties, your tariffs, but then you set up a plant, a small production hub, right? Where a lot of the products of the shirts are being sourced in Nigeria or in Ghana or in Ivory Coast or in Cameroon, right? And then you begin to take advantage of that partnership of finding a similar company there, that you guys form a partnership, you set up an operation, and then you'll be able to have your goods and services being able to be exported into an entire 33 trading bloc in 54 plus countries. But the 34 countries actually signed the compact to ratify the Continental Free Trade Agreement. That gives you a bigger market. So you're a small business operating in Richmond, Virginia.
Right.
You're making t-shirts, but now you have an entire continent that becomes a platform for you to trade by just going through the bells and whistles of setting up a smaller operational. But the key is product of origin, right? Making sure that it's being produced in Ghana or in Cameroon or in Liberia. So therefore it creates jobs, but also expands that opportunity. So you went from thinking local to thinking global, which I think is a game changer for small business in the United States, which they can partner up with their counterparts here.
All right, now let us stay with small businesses. From a small business perspective, how can advocacy groups like the SBA, the Small Business Administration, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the SCORE, the National Business Association, and the International Council of Businesses, how can they engage Africa and its counterparts?
Great question, Ponzi. I had the honor last year being the chairman of the EXO SME, where it was an advocacy group that brings small businesses together to have conversations around export. And to my surprise, many of these advocacy groups are saying the same thing. They want tools to allow them to be able to do export. So it's the education of their chambers that's extremely important, right? Being able to demystify how to do trade. So when you begin to have a conversation with small business owners around trade, there's a lot of barriers. Bill of lading becomes a conversation. Letter of credit. Are my goods safe? What are the regulatory reform that I need to be aware of? These are some of the barriers. So these associations' first mandate should be to learn how to break these barriers down through education, empowerment, trade shows, and so forth. That's the first step that they can take. Second step would be to understand that Africa cannot be, or let's be more specific, West Africa Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, so forth, can be a place where the product dumping is. It has to be a level of engagement and pro-sharing of production. So that's the second part, where you're not just transactional, but you graduate from how do I set up a mini plant or mini manufacturer, so therefore it becomes a win-win, where now I can export to Europe, I can export to many African countries, so forth.
And so my next question is somewhat piggybacking on that, what you just said. What role do you think governance and technology should play in the relationship between the two regions, between the United States and Africa?
Technology is everything now. We can't get away from technology. So we have Internet of Things. We have tools that we can use to ensure that technology is at the forefront to lower costs, to kind of bridge that gap between, okay, you being 5,000 miles away and I'm here, we can't do business together.
Right.
So we can leverage technology. Now, technology is very, very broad, right? So let's talk about fintech. Ghana is leading the entire world in the transactional volume per capita, per their population size, if abstracted, in the number of transactions that people are doing on mobile money, where they're using it to pay everyday bills, if it's utility, if it's paying for a taxi, right? So now in the United States, we're still a little bit old-fashioned.
And so, Professor, you said earlier that with regard to the trade value between China and the and Africa, it was valued at $148 billion or so. With between the United States and Africa, it was valued at $55 billion or so. There's a difference of approximately $100 billion, give or take. That's a lot of territory that the United States would have to catch up to China. How can it do that?
You know, and that's a great question. And there's a large disparity between that trade gap that we want to also do a lot of work in that area. So you have policymakers that are figuring out it can't be business as usual. It can't be put in slow motion. It has to be accelerated by making sure that all the agencies that I alluded to earlier, so you had Exim Bank is one of the agencies, you had MCC is one of the agencies, USAID, where we got to ensure that all these interagencies that are pro-growth, pro-security, pro-economic for the United States engage in the business, commercial side or trade, is that we're all singing from the same hymn book. That's the first thing that can help accelerate, that can eliminate a lot of the bureaucracies and the bottlenecks that are within these agencies that slows down small businesses or large-scale multinationals from doing business in that part. That's number one. Number two, again, fostering these chambers, right? Leveraging on chambers. I'm a big fan of chambers of commerce, setting up reciprocal ones in different countries. So therefore, there's that dialogue between the local, we call it local content, many African countries, and then in the US counterparts, to ensure that there's this bridge of communication that, again, can speed up that whole entire process. Then the third part has to be education, right? And being able to inform the American people that Africa is ready for business, right? The days of back in the early 90s when we had structural adjustment reforms, where many government hands were being tied, things were not as liberal when it came to regulation to ensure that these economic growth was prudent. Those regulations have been laid back, not in area of not businesses to be successful, but to allow it to be more pro-business, right? To ensure that it's a win-win proposition for both the countries, that they're following the rule of law, that they're paying proper taxes, and it has become a more of an enabling environment for the growth to allow that to happen. So I think it's extremely important.
And
that can speed up that gap.
A quick question, because you've given three proponents, but we are not talking about $100 million. We're talking about $100 billion, which is a huge difference, I would think. The three proponents that you just mentioned, objectives, are they enough for the United States to gain track, to gain grounds, and catch up to China?
Yes, it is, because I did not mention specific sectors. I was very, very intentional. If you're in the abstractive industry, right, oil and gas, mining particularly, those are extremely capital intensive.
Exactly.
There could be one massive investment from, let's say, Cosmos or ExxonMobil or any other U.S. exploration company, and that can bring in $70 billion.
Right.
Then we're talking about the middle of the pack, right? Looking at manufacturing. So I think if we get the structure correctly, and there's enough appetite for wanting to do business in the African countries and make it reciprocal, right? It can generate that buzz that we can propel that growth and close that 100 billion gap at no time. It's not about the amount alone, which is important. Foreign direct investment is very important. It's a good indicator to look at. But I think once we have that structure of that, Africa is ready for business, the US is ready for business, I think the small businesses can take a portion of that, the mid-sized business can take a portion of that, and then the small scale can also take a portion of that also.
All right, let us skip over to a different area now.
Yes, please.
What are some major security threats and concerns facing Africa today that US businesses and government should be aware of?
Directly, the youthful population. And I will expand on that in a little bit. And I think there's a phrase that I like a little bit. It says, injustice somewhere is injustice everywhere. And if we don't take this opportunity to look at the population boom, that by the year 2050, it's been forecasted that 1/3 of the global youth will reside in sub-Saharan Africa. That becomes, now how do I link that to national security concern?
Right.
That becomes a breeding ground for Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth.
Right.
So that is the pinpoint of national security concern for me at this moment. How do we create an enabling environment to absorb it through employment, through education, the youthful population that is coming in? Health. Recently, Ebola was a concern.
Right.
Through interagency coordination, we were able to keep that at bay.
Right.
COVID-19. So public outbreak is another area of concern that could become a national security concern. Last but not least, we're looking at climate refugee. The world is changing. There's an issue around climate change. You have Lake Chad, water rescinding. You have some parts of Southeast Asia, massive flood. And majority of Africans are agricultural based. So if there's massive drought, that becomes food insecurity, which can link into national security around violence, and then being able to be recruited into national terrorism and so forth. So that's very important to look at. Do you think that electronic or technological threats are a national security issue? Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. So in the area of cybersecurity, right? Threats. So you have many young people all around the world, not just on the African continent, that are using espionage, using ransomware, where they can hijack your laptop and then leverage on cryptocurrency to be able to extort whatever they need to extort. So that's another area of collaboration, right, between the private sector and the public sector, right, and ensuring that information is being shared, right, databases are available, so therefore we could be more proactive than reactive in cybersecurity, espionage, so forth.
If cybersecurity is a threat that should be viewed upon, do you see it stemming from the continent?
Oh, absolutely, because if there's not an outlet, and I use the word outlet because you have three types of employment, right? You have structural unemployment, cyclical unemployment, and then fictional unemployment.
Right.
And structural unemployment is a big one I want to focus more on. So structural unemployment is where it takes your skills as a fit into the economy. So you don't have skills to be employed. So you become idle. That's the concern.
Right.
It's where our kids become very young, our young professionals, our young adults and so forth become very idle.
Right.
And then many of them will turn into avenues where they can make very fast money.
Yes.
And then they turn on a laptop. Next thing you know, they're engaging in some cyber activities that are not safe. And I'm using very blanket terms. So them being idle is my concern.
Right.
And then them having access to the internet, it's another concern if it's not used as a proper tool.
Right.
And then you can tool as a skill that they could be coders. Right. They could be web designers, or they could be building infrastructure. All right, both technology-driven infrastructure, excuse me, that they can leverage that to create apps, they can create jobs, they can create industries that we haven't seen yet.
All right. Now, using your expertise, given the current course of the relationship between the United States and the continent, where do you see the relationship between these two regions, say, within the next 50 years?
There's a bright future. I'm forever an optimist, but not a blind optimist. There's a great opportunity for the United States and the African continent to foster this amazing relationship for the next plus 50 years. What makes me so optimistic about this relationship? It's a reset relationship. It's a reset. Reset simply meaning that the continent has become very progressive. They have a vibrant workforce, vibrant, intelligent young people, eager to be part of the global society. United States of America have had 200 plus years of perfecting our democracy. We made some mistakes. We've had a lot of great success. We are a beacon for other countries to look at, to learn some best practices. So imagine fostering that partnership and that relationship into the future. And I think both countries can learn from each other. It could be reciprocal. It makes me extremely optimistic. Areas of collaboration. We know for a fact that more Africans' areas of employment, right, is agricultural based. Many more are shifting to service based. So if you look at how GDP is broken down, it's a component of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and then a function between exports and imports, right? But the C part of it is the consumption. So just like you look in the middle of the pyramid, there's a bulk of Africans that are graduating economically, right? Where they come into what we call the middle of the pyramid, middle income class. Right. Then you have your top tier. Now, still the bottom of the pyramid is still an issue. So imagine fostering a great relationship with a country that has done a great job in understanding agriculture, understanding services, understanding manufacturing, can be a best practice of both worlds. And that's what makes me so optimistic, where the US can lean on many African countries, many African countries can also lean on the US, and becomes vice versa, because it becomes a market, right? So think about this. So the US makes up only 5% of the world's population, only 5%. In 2050, not too long from now, right, Africa will have 2.5 billion people, as alluded earlier in this conversation. The US will need a market. The difference in the future of their relationship now should be, how do we partner up? Not how do we dump products and services? That's exciting. And now it opens up an entire market for you of you produce in an African country, they consume the product, and the excess can be shipped back to the United States or be shipped to Europe, and you have the whole market. That's exciting.
I'm going to ask a question similar to the one I just asked you and you just answered. Now, as you said earlier, the United Nations predicts that Africa will double its population size in 2050 by 2.5 billion people. That will be the population here in the continent, which would amount for approximately 25% of the world's population.
Absolutely.
Now, then the question is, thinking on the continent only, or about the continent only, where do you think Africa will position itself 50 years from now?
That's a great question. And the position is very, very important, right? Of how it could be positioned to be able to create jobs for its own people. I think it has to be industrialization. That has to be the epic center of Africa's strategy. And again, I do not work for the African Union, for full disclosure. Africans are brilliant people. They have their own policy makers, and they have their own long-term strategy. But the positioning will have to be industrialization. That industrialization, the bedrock of that has to be ensuring that there's ample roads, ensuring that there's infrastructure at their ports, ensuring that they have industrial scale of manufacturing to absorb 10,000 people, to be able to take their raw materials. And we've been hearing a lot about that, right? And get into what I call a second stage. That second stage will be now adding some value, some level, second level value before it's either consumed locally, right, for production, or before it's exported. That has to be a gradual, long-term, mid-term plan that's quite intentional, maybe starting with cash crops, maybe getting into the abstractive industry and being able to consume these same products that you produce. That has to be an intentional positioning on the African continent. And I know the United States is extremely proud to partner wherever we can in the areas of academia and areas of policy to ensure that this could be a reality.
Very well. Now, we've talked about China, we've talked about the United States, we've talked about West Africa and the continent itself. There's one major player in all of this that we need to talk about that has not been spoken of quite often, I think, and that is the African diaspora in the United States.
Right.
It is said that the Africans in the United States amount for approximately 5.8% of the United States immigration population. It is also a very important asset for the continent, which if it is catalyzed, it can be harnessed to its full potential. How can we get the African diaspora, and should we, I guess, the question should be, get the African diaspora involved in this dynamic?
Great, you've done great research in this space. And if I can just add on to that fact that you just alluded to a moment ago, since 1970, the diaspora community in the United States doubles every decade. It's a game changer, again, alluded to with after the Continental Trade Agreement. It's a repertoire of knowledge, experience that the African continent can lean in. Historical data points.
Right.
In the early 80s and then into the 90s, we had what we call a brain drain in many African countries. Now that has to be reversed. And it has to be very fluent, of course, immigration policy. But the diaspora community in the United States of America could be that bridge where collaboration could be done, where cultural norms could be respected, where traditions could be upheld, and that it's an area where beyond the remittances, right? So remittances is a huge part of the economic growth of many African countries, whereas the industry is about $658 billion in remittances alone. Some countries even factor that into their GDP. Right. So now how do we graduate that conversation from me just sending money home to now me transferring my skills back home and vice versa, right? So it doesn't mean that you don't have to always come back, right? But how does the United States create a policy where we leverage on that experience of being born on the soil and then being there and then having that.
And when we say the United States, of course, we talk about the country itself and about the government itself. But here we're talking about the diaspora itself, the African diaspora.
Right.
How? Give me a specific.
Okay.
How can the diaspora be engaged in the dynamic in the finances or in the economics, if you will, in the diplomacy that needs to occur between Africa, between the continent and other regions? How can it be involved, engaged on the continent?
Thermostat in 3 areas.
Okay.
1, accountability. So in the diaspora community, we be more direct, they can engage politically, right? Engage in ensuring that elected officials in this part of the world, if they still hold citizenship, are doing the right thing. So that civic engagement doesn't just stop because you left the continent.
Right.
So the civic engagement is extremely important.
Okay.
2, invested. They have resources. They have financial resources. They have intellectual resources. Being able to invest.
Okay.
Into the continent, it's another area. And then last but not least, which I think is extremely important also equally, is ensuring that there's a two-way dialogue, right, of educating a lot of their counterparts about what is working there and what is not working there.
Right.
And I think if that area is put together, the diaspora has a huge role to play. Civically being engaged, politically, as best as you can, investing, and then educating yourselves about the issues that are happening in both countries, and then find out the best practices to be involved. But having that remote control mindset, I alluded to in one interview already I did while I was here, is it can't be remote control. It can't be very passive. It has to be very aggressive, very reactive, right? Approach to how do I bring my skills, my expertise, and have an open mind right? That it may work in the United States, but it also has to be altered to be able to work in this part of the world.
And lastly today, my last question, should the American government engage in some way the diaspora, the African diaspora, for its dynamics, its relation, whether it be economics or diplomacy on the continent?
Absolutely. And for full disclosure, I don't speak for the United States government. But as a citizen, as a patriot, as someone that can put 1 foot here and 1 foot there equally.
And based on your expertise also,
yes,
Mr.
And it's extremely important where in your question already, that where we have the 8 ball, we need every help possible to ensure that we can engage the diaspora, engage the members of this part of the world to help speed up our relationship with this part of the world. So I think it's the onus, right, will be on the United States government to say where we can get help and engagement and involvement to help us better understand how to engage Africa as a partner. And I use the word engage in a very, very sensitive way, because we have to see Africa from a different paradigm.
Right.
It can't be the paradigm of aid. It can't be the paradigm of giving, rightfully so. It has to be a view of, okay, that this is my partner, that there's something that I can benefit from Africa, and Africa can also benefit from me in a very equal playing field. And I think it can change that conversation that the United States have. And closing on my part, thank you for this opportunity, for this great dialogue. I see this relationship being fostered in a very positive way. And I charge many of my colleagues in academia, in the business sector, to see Africa in a different light. Africa is a bright space. We're late to the party. We're extremely late to the party. If you look on the continent, you will see the Indian population, the Lebanese population, the Chinese population engaging, infiltrating in their businesses, in their communities, even developing relationships, right? On a romantic side,
yes,
where they have invested themselves. We have taken more of a remote control, passive approach to Africa. And I think for the foreseeable future, we will miss this opportunity over the next frontier. It's a dynamic continent. You could be on the West Coast, it's a completely different experience. You could be in the North, completely different experience. You could be in the South, you could be in the East. So you have to take Africa for what it is worth. And I think that I'm confident now that I think that the continent it has a right future. If it partners up, and when it partners up with the United States of America, it's only going to get better. And I use this opportunity to learn about the trade opportunity that's happening. It's extremely important. To look at the youthful population, it's extremely important. And then last but not least, being able to engage in good governance. And I think that is the pillar that we can stand on to ensure that we have a win-win relationship with Africa and the United States.
We'll end it on that. And thank you so much for being here with us, Professor Abengbile. And this afternoon, we spoke about basically the relationship that the United States should have with the continent, or on the continent. One of economic trade, one of educational, and one of manufacturing as well. All of this is something that the United States should be focused on, according to the words of Professor Abengbile. We thank you for your viewership, and we'll see you in the future.